Emily had spent years nurturing a quiet dream, a sanctuary of her own, a refuge where she could shed the relentless clamour of the city and breathe freely. After tireless work and meticulous saving, that dream crystallised into reality. She purchased a quaint, cosy house perched on the edge of a serene lake, its shimmering waters framed by whispering pines. The drive from the city was a mere hour, a small price for the promise of peace. In her mind's eye, she saw herself there on weekends, wrapped in stillness, the weight of urban life slipping away. She pictured lively gatherings, friends spilling onto the porch, laughter echoing over the water, intimate dinners with loved ones under a canopy of stars. This was her haven, a personal paradise where worries dissolved like mist in the morning sun. Emily threw herself into planning her new life with uncontainable excitement. She envisioned every detail, how she and James would wander through antique shops and hardware stores, hand-picking furniture that spoke to their shared taste, perhaps a weathered oak table for the dining room, a plush sofa in deep green to sink into after long days. She could already hear the crackle of a fire in the stone hearth they'd restore together, see the shelves they'd line with books and mementos of their adventures. Each morning she'd step outside with a steaming mug of coffee, the forest air cool against her skin as she traced paths through the trees. Afternoons would find her slicing through the lake's glassy surface, the water rippling around her with every stroke. Evenings she'd settle on the terrace with a novel, the pages glowing in the golden hour light, or she'd hum softly in the kitchen, stirring a pot of something rich and savoury, maybe her mother's beef stew recipe, for James to savour when he arrived. "Smells incredible," James would say, leaning against the doorframe with that easy grin of his sleeves rolled up from tinkering with some project or another. She'd smile back, her heart swelling. This was fulfillment, she thought, her dreams no longer distant stars but a warm, tangible reality. James, her husband of 5 years, matched her enthusiasm with a quiet, steady joy. He'd dive into her plans with a spark in his eyes, flipping through catalogues over breakfast or sketching layouts on napkins. "What if we put the armchair by the window here?" he'd suggest, tapping the paper, his voice warm with possibility. "You'd have the best view of the lake." Emily loved watching him like this, his brow furrowed in thought as he measured a wall for shelves, or his laugh when she vetoed his idea for a bright orange rug. "Fine, fine," he'd concede, raising his hands in mock surrender. "But don't blame me when you miss out on my bold vision." She'd roll her eyes, but inside she glowed. His investment in their little retreat felt like a promise, a shared future unfolding in every nail he hammered, every colour they debated. To Emily, this house wasn't just wood and stone. It was their nest, a cornerstone for the family they'd always talked about building. Here she believed their love would deepen, their roots entwining as surely as the trees beyond their windows. That day, James stood at the window, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the fading light, gazing out at the water. She smiled to herself, imagining a cosy night ahead. Maybe a movie, a shared blanket, the crackle of the fireplace. But when he turned, the air shifted. His face was taut, shadowed with something strange, tension, guilt, a flicker of unease that snagged her breath. Her happiness faltered, a cold ripple of doubt stirring in her chest. "Emily, we need to talk," he said, his voice low and heavy, stripped of its usual warmth. She switched off the stove with a trembling hand and sank into a chair across from him at the kitchen table, her pulse thudding in her ears. "What happened, James? You're scaring me," she murmured, her eyes searching his, desperate for a clue. He drew a deep breath, his chest rising as if bracing for impact, and then the words tumbled out. "Sarah and Ethan are coming over soon," he said, pausing before dropping the rest. "They're going to move in with us here at the lake house." Emily's mind stuttered, confusion clouding her thoughts. She tilted her head, frowning. "What's going on with them this time?" she asked, her voice soft but edged with wariness. James shifted in his seat, his hands clasping together on the table. Sarah's been depressed, really down since she got fired. She needs help, he explained, his tone almost rehearsed. And, there's plenty of space here. It's better for them than wasting money on some cramped apartment until they figure things out. She stared at him, the words sinking in slowly, each one a pebble rippling across the still waters of her peace. The lake house, their refuge, her dream, was suddenly a bargaining chip, and the weight of his decision pressed against her, unasked and unwelcome. Emily froze, the words hitting her like a sudden gust of cold wind. She stared at him, her mind scrambling to process what he'd just dropped into the air between them. Silence stretched taut as she swallowed the lump rising in her throat. How could he decide something so monumental without a single word to her? How could he so carelessly upend their shared sanctuary, the dream she'd poured her heart into? "James," she finally said, her voice quivering with a mix of shock and rising anger. "Do you even hear yourself? This is our home. We planned this together. Weekends here, a life here, a family. This was supposed to be us." Her hands clenched at her sides, nails digging into her palms as she fought to keep her composure. He sighed, running a hand through his hair, his expression softening but not yielding. "Emily, don't make this bigger than it is. I've thought it through. It's just temporary. They need help right now. Ethan especially needs his father, and I want to be there for him. It's the right thing to do." Her chest tightened, indignation giving way to a raw, aching disbelief. "And what about me?" she asked, her voice breaking as she stepped closer, searching his face for some flicker of recognition. "Did you even stop to think about my feelings, my plans? This place, it's not just a house, James. It's everything I've dreamed of, everything we've built together." James shrugged, a small dismissive gesture that cut deeper than his words. "You'll have to accept it, Emily. It's done. Sarah's already packing. They'll be here in a few days." He turned away, reaching for his coffee mug as if the conversation were over, leaving her standing there, the weight of his decision pressing down like a stone. Emily's breath hitched, her eyes stinging as she watched him sip his coffee, the steam curling up between them. Sarah, Ethan, names that had once been distant threads in their life. His ex-wife, his son from that earlier chapter, now loomed like storm clouds over her paradise. She'd known James wanted to be a good father, had admired it even. But this was a betrayal dressed up as duty, and it left her reeling, the cozy walls of their lake house suddenly feeling like they were closing in. Nearly 6 months earlier, a shadow of this same upheaval had crept into Emily's life. James had come home one evening, his keys clattering onto the counter as he announced, almost offhandedly, "Sarah and Ethan are going to stay in the guest room for a few weeks." Emily had looked up from the book she'd been reading, her brow furrowing as he continued. "Her lease is up, and it's just temporary, 3 weeks tops. It'll help her save some money until she gets settled." His voice had carried that same unshakable certainty, as if the matter were already sealed. Emily's stomach had twisted, a quiet resentment flaring. He hadn't asked, hadn't even hinted at it beforehand. Their apartment, their space, wasn't his to offer up like that. "You didn't think to talk to me first?" she'd said, her tone sharp but measured, hoping he'd hear the hurt beneath it. He'd only shrugged, muttering something about it being no big deal, and that was that. 3 weeks, he'd promised. But those weeks stretched into 3 months, a slow unravelling of her peace. Sarah's new job, the supposed reason for the delay, kept getting pushed back, a vague excuse that rang hollower each time Emily heard it. A nagging suspicion took root. Maybe the job didn't even exist. Maybe Sarah had no intention of leaving. What gnawed at Emily most wasn't the inconvenience. It was the way she felt erased in her own home. James had been working remotely then, his days unfolding in the apartment while Emily clocked long hours at the office. She'd drag herself through the door each evening, weary and craving the comfort of their routine, only to find him at the dining table with Sarah and sometimes Ethan. The air would be thick with the scent of a meal. Sarah had cooked lasagna one night, roast chicken the next, plates already cleared, laughter spilling out as they traded old stories from a life Emily hadn't been part of. "Remember that time in 2009 when we got stuck in the rain?" Sarah would say, her voice bright, and James would chuckle, his eyes crinkling in a way Emily hadn't seen in months. She'd stand in the doorway, unnoticed for a beat too long, feeling like an intruder in her own marriage. It got worse. One afternoon, Emily came home to find Sarah folding James's shirts in the living room, a neat stack of his laundry piled on the couch. The sight made her blood simmer. She'd cornered Sarah later, keeping her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside. "You don't need to do that," she'd said, gesturing to the clothes. "I've got it covered." Sarah had barely looked up, her hands smoothing a sleeve as she replied, "Oh, it's no trouble. You're so busy, Emily. I don't mind helping out around the house." Her tone was light, almost saccharine, but it landed like a barb. Emily had stood there, jaw tight, unable to shake the feeling that Sarah wasn't just folding shirts, she was staking a claim, inch by inch, to the life Emily had built with James. And he, oblivious or unwilling to see it, let it happen, leaving Emily stranded on the outside of a family she'd thought was hers. One evening, Emily pushed open the front door, her shoulders sagging from a grueling day, and stepped into a scene that made her pause. The apartment was quiet, save for the faint rustle of fabric from their bedroom. She found James propped up in bed, a paperback splayed across his chest, his reading glasses slipping down his nose as he turned a page. Down the hall, Sarah hummed softly, her silhouette framed by the open closet door as she sorted through their clothes, stacking sweaters and hanging shirts with a methodical ease that felt far too familiar. Emily's pulse quickened, a tight knot forming in her chest. She set her bag down with deliberate calm and crossed to the bedroom, catching James's arm gently but firmly. "Can we talk?" she murmured, nodding toward the living room. He followed her, a faint smile tugging at his lips as she closed the door behind them. "What's going on, Em?" he asked, leaning against the arm of the couch, his tone light, almost amused. She took a breath, steadying herself. "James, I came home to find Sarah organizing our closet, our bedroom. Doesn't that strike you as off? She's everywhere, all the time, and I'm starting to feel like I don't even belong here." He chuckled, a low, warm sound that only stoked her frustration. "Come on, Em. It's kind of cute that you're getting jealous." He stepped closer, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his touch tender but dismissive. "You've got nothing to worry about. I love you, you know that. I want to build a beautiful, sweet life with you, just like we've always talked about. But right now, Sarah's in a bind. I'm not going to kick the mother of my kid out on the street, and I'm not shelling out for a motel when they can just stay with us. It's temporary. I promise." Emily searched his eyes, wanting to believe him. His words carried the weight of sincerity, that same steady assurance she'd fallen for years ago. She loved him, deeply, fiercely. And maybe that love clouded her vision, softening edges she should have examined more closely. She nodded slowly, forcing a small smile, though doubt lingered like a splinter beneath her skin. "Okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll try to understand." James squeezed her hand, his grin widening as he pulled her into a quick hug. "That's my girl," he said, kissing the top of her head before heading back to his book. But as Emily stood there, the muffled sound of Sarah's humming drifting through the walls, she couldn't shake the ache gnawing at her. She loved him enough to bend, to trust, to ignore the warning flicker in her gut, but part of her wondered if that love was blinding her to a truth she wasn't ready to face. Emily and James had crossed paths 5 years ago, a chance meeting that sparked something steady and bright between them. They'd been married for 3 of those years, building a life that, for a time, felt like a quiet triumph. When they first met, Emily was a whirlwind of energy, Lean and athletic, her days filled with early morning runs and weekend hikes, her body a testament to discipline and drive. But life had a way of shifting beneath her feet. 2 years into their relationship, she suffered a miscarriage, a loss that hollowed her out, followed soon after by her father's grueling battle with cancer and his eventual passing. Grief settled over her like a heavy fog, and depression took root, dulling the edges of the woman she'd once been. Through it all, she kept showing up, clocking long hours at work, her desk a fortress of papers and coffee cups, even as her spirit frayed. Exercise, once her outlet, fell away. In its place came late-night takeout and bags of chips crunched mindlessly in front of the TV. Over 2 years, her frame softened, 40 pounds creeping onto her hips and waist. She'd catch her reflection sometimes, unfamiliar, rounded, and feel a pang of guilt, a quiet shame that she wasn't the woman James had first fallen for. But James never wavered. He'd sit with her on those bleak evenings, sharing greasy fries or scooping ice cream into bowls, his presence a balm. "You're still you, Em," he'd say when she'd spiral into self-doubt, his voice soft but firm, his hand finding hers across the couch. Once, after a particularly rough day when she'd broken down over a pair of jeans that wouldn't button, she'd turned to him, her eyes red and serious. "James, I mean it. If this isn't what you signed up for, if you want out, I'd understand. I wouldn't blame you." Her voice trembled, but she held his gaze, offering him an escape she half expected him to take. Instead, he'd gone quiet, his brow furrowing as he studied her. Then, without a word, he'd slipped out of the room, only to return minutes later, dropping to one knee in their cluttered living room, a small velvet box in his hand. "Emily," he'd said, his grin crooked and earnest. "I'm not going anywhere. Marry me." She'd stared, stunned, laughter bubbling up through her tears as she nodded, pulling him into a hug that felt like coming home. That moment shifted everything. His proposal wasn't just a ring, it was proof, tangible and warm, that his love wasn't tied to her size or her strength, but to the messy, resilient heart of her. It cracked open something in Emily, deepening her love for him into something fiercer, more unshakable. James was real, she realized, genuine in a way that anchored her through the storm. And as they stood at the altar months later, her dress hugging curves she was still learning to embrace, she knew she'd found a partner who saw her, truly, and chose her anyway. As the years unfurled, Emily began to notice the threads that still tethered James to his past, specifically to Sarah, his ex-wife. It wasn't a sudden revelation, but a slow dawning, like the gradual creep of dusk. James never hid his connection to Sarah. It was woven into the fabric of his life, tied irrevocably to Ethan, the son they shared. Emily, with her generous heart, had never begrudged him this. She'd watched him send checks for school supplies or drive across town for Ethan's soccer games, and she'd kept her lips sealed, never once speaking ill of his commitment to his old family. In fact, she admired it, saw it as a mark of his character, a quiet nobility in how he refused to abandon those he'd once vowed to care for. To James, her silence was a virtue, a sign of her strength. "You're amazing, you know that?" he'd say sometimes, squeezing her shoulder after a call with Sarah about Ethan's latest milestone. Not everyone would get it. And Emily would smile, a little tightly, because she did get it, more than he realized. She'd told herself early on that his loyalty to Ethan, and by extension Sarah, was a good thing. It spoke to the kind of man he was, dependable, responsible, unwilling to let distance or time erase his role as a father. She even found a strange comfort in it, a reassurance that flickered in the back of her mind. If their own marriage ever crumbled, if the day came when they stood on opposite sides of a divorce, James's track record suggested he'd treat her with the same decency. He wouldn't vanish, wouldn't shirk his promises. That thought, however bittersweet, softened the edges of her unease, so she let it be. When Sarah's name popped up on his phone or he'd mention a quick trip to help with something Ethan needed, a broken bike, a school project, Emily nodded, her leniency a shield she wore proudly. He's a good dad, she'd tell herself, stirring a pot on the stove or folding laundry, pushing down the faint ache that sometimes followed. She loved James too much to pick at the seams of his past, and besides, Ethan was a bright, lanky kid with James's crooked grin. How could she resent that? She convinced herself it was fine, noble even, that she could share him with this piece of his history. But as time wore on, that leniency began to feel less like grace and more like a weight she hadn't signed up to carry. James and Sarah's story had its own rhythm, one that predated Emily by years and carried a weight she could only glimpse from the outside. They'd been inseparable in high school, best friends who shared locker notes and late-night phone calls, their bond forged in the easy intimacy of youth. That friendship had blossomed into something more, and after years of dating, through college, first jobs, and the messy thrill of early adulthood, they'd tied the knot. For 5 years, they'd built a life together, a tapestry of shared routines and quiet dreams. Ethan arrived in their final year as husband and wife, a bright spark born into a marriage already fraying at the edges. When the divorce came, it didn't sever the cord between them, not fully. James had never let it. After James dropped the bombshell that Sarah and Ethan would be moving into the lake house soon, Emily teetered on the edge of letting it slide. She'd spent years bending, rationalizing, swallowing her unease for the sake of peace, and maybe she could have done it again. But the very next day, something shifted the ground beneath her feet, and there was no unseeing it. Emily had never been the type to pry into James's life. She trusted him, or at least she'd convinced herself she did, and she'd always kept a respectful distance from his private corners. That afternoon, though, she'd grabbed his laptop to check a recipe. Hers was charging, and his was already open on the kitchen table, a habit they'd fallen into over the years. She clicked through tabs absent-mindedly, her mind still churning over their argument, when his messenger window popped into view. It was open, the chat with Sarah glowing on the screen, time-stamped from that very morning. A flicker of curiosity sparked in her chest, sharp and unbidden. She hesitated, her cursor hovering, a voice in her head whispering that it wasn't right to snoop. But then another voice, louder, rawer, cut through. After everything, didn't she deserve to know? James had left it open after all. If he had nothing to hide, what was the harm? She was wrong. So wrong. The messages unfurled before her, and with each line, her breath grew shallower, her hands trembling against the keys. James was venting to Sarah, his words dripping with a venom she'd never imagined he could wield. He griped about her job, how she was always at the office like it's her real husband, and her cooking, calling it barely edible half the time. But it was the jabs at her weight that hit like a punch to the gut. "She's gotten so disgusting, Sarah," he'd typed. "I can hardly stand sharing a bed with her. She snores like a damn dog now, rolls of fat shaking every time she breathes." Emily's eyes burned as she scrolled, disbelief giving way to a sickening dread. Then she saw the photos. Her heart stopped. There she was, captured in grainy snapshots James had sent, pictures of her sleeping, sprawled across their bed, sometimes in just her underwear. One showed her curled on her side, her belly spilling over the waistband, with a caption, "Check out the double chin on this one." Another caught her from behind, her back creased with what he'd labelled back boobs, followed by a string of laughing emojis. Sarah's replies were quick, gleeful. "Oh my God, she's massive!" and, "You poor thing," stuck with that. At some point, Sarah had chimed in with a nickname, White Whale, and James had latched onto it, typing, "Perfect, that's her now." They'd gone back and forth, cackling through text, a private comedy routine built on her humiliation. Emily sat there, the laptop's glow casting harsh shadows across her face, her world tilting. The man she'd loved, the one who'd knelt before her with a ring and promises, had turned her into a punchline. And Sarah, Sarah, who folded his shirts and cooked his dinners, had been in on it, laughing at her from the sidelines. The lake house, her dream, their life. It all felt like a cruel joke now, and she was the last to get it. The deeper Emily scrolled, the clearer it became. James hadn't meant to leave his messenger open. This wasn't carelessness. It was a window into a world he'd kept locked tight. There, in black and white pixels, Sarah reminisced about their old days, her words laced with a coy nostalgia. Remember how we'd sneak off to the lake? Wish we could go back. James didn't just play along, he leaned into it, typing. Those were the best times. You always knew how to keep things fun. Sarah's flirtations danced across the screen. Bet I could still turn your head. And James lapped it up, replying, You never stopped. It was a side of him Emily didn't recognize, a version that thrived in Sarah's glow while tearing her apart in the shadows. Her mind reeled, grasping for sense. What he'd written didn't match the man she'd lived with. He'd told her he loved her, whispered it over morning coffee, murmured it against her skin in the dark. Their intimacy had been electric, his hands tracing her curves with a hunger that felt real, his breath hot and urgent as they moved together. If he was disgusted by her, as he'd claimed to Sarah, he'd have to be an Oscar-worthy actor to fake that kind of passion. Emily's thoughts churned. Maybe he didn't mean it. Maybe he was posturing, exaggerating to impress Sarah. But why? Why lie so viciously, so gleefully about the woman he'd hand-vowed to cherish? The realization hit her like a cold slap. He'd been playing a game and she'd been the fool. A bitter laugh escaped her lips, sharp and jagged as she slammed the laptop shut. She wouldn't cry, not for him. He didn't deserve her tears, not after this. The pain was a live wire in her chest, but she swallowed it down, letting it harden into something else, resolve icy and unyielding. She was done. This marriage was over. But she wouldn't just walk away quietly, tail between her legs. No, she'd end it with flair, a grand exit that would leave him reeling. James had underestimated her for too long, and she was about to show him exactly who he'd lost. Emily buried her pain deep, wearing a mask of calm as she moved through the day. James didn't deserve to see her unravel. Not yet. While he clattered around the kitchen or scrolled through his phone, she sat quietly, her mind spinning with the plan taking shape. She'd rehearsed it in her head, each step a brick in the wall she was building between them. But when evening fell and James laced up his sneakers for a run, the house grew still and her facade cracked. She slipped into the bedroom, turned the lock with a soft click and sank onto the edge of the bed. The tears came then, hot and unrelenting, spilling down her cheeks as her shoulders shook. She was a woman after all, flesh and blood, not stone. The hurt clawed at her, sharp and searing, mingling with a strange, gnawing fear. What if James's betrayal ran deeper? What if he had darker intentions lurking behind his lies? She let herself cry until her throat ached, but the tears brought no solace, only a hollow exhaustion. Wiping her face with the back of her hand, she straightened, a new clarity cutting through the fog. Tears wouldn't save her. She had to act, to shield herself, and whatever future she had left. Her fingers found her phone, and she dialed her mother, Lauren, the one person she could always lean on. No questions asked. "Mum, I need your help," Emily said, her voice quaking, adrenaline mixing with the ache. "Emily? What's wrong, darling? You're scaring me," Lauren replied, her tone tight with worry. The whole story poured out. James's messages, the photos, the cruel nickname, the flirtations with Sarah. Emily's words stumbled over each other, raw with pain, anger, and a bitter disbelief that this was her life now. Lauren listened, her silence a steady anchor on the other end of the line. "Don't worry, sweetheart," Lauren said when Emily finally paused, her voice warm but resolute. "We'll figure something out." There was a beat of quiet, the hum of the phone line stretching between them. Then Lauren spoke again, firm and decisive. "You need to sell that house, Emily. And fast." Emily blinked, caught off guard. Sell the lake house? Her dream, the cozy refuge she'd scrimped and saved for, the place she'd painted with hopes of a family? "Mom, I don't know. I worked so hard for it," she said, her voice small, clinging to the vision she'd once held. "I know, honey," Lauren softened, "but that dream was for you and James. It's not yours anymore. Not with him in it like this. Let it go. Start fresh." The truth settled over her, heavy but clear. The house wasn't her sanctuary now. It was a stage for James's deceit, a backdrop to her humiliation. She nodded, though Lauren couldn't see it. "Okay, I'll do it." Lauren promised to handle the details, saying she'd call a realtor friend that night. True to her word, the phone rang again within the hour, her mother's voice bright with news. "He's already got someone in mind, a potential buyer. Can you believe it?" Emily exhaled, steadying herself. "Good. But I want to meet them, Mom. I need to see who's taking it, to know it's going to someone who'll love it." Her voice held a quiet resolve. She'd let the house go, but she wouldn't hand it off blindly. It was the last piece of control she could claim, and she'd wield it with purpose. The buyers arrived the next afternoon, stepping out of a weathered sedan with the kind of gentle ease that comes with years spent together. Paul and Grace Robinson were an elderly couple, their faces etched with soft lines and quiet smiles. Paul, wiry and silver-haired, adjusted his glasses as he took in the lake's shimmer, while Grace, her white curls tucked under a wide-brimmed hat, clasped her hands in delight at the sight of the porch. They'd been dreaming of a house like this for years, they told Emily, a peaceful retreat to spend their golden days, far from the clamour of their old suburban life. As they wandered through the rooms, Paul tracing the woodwork with a craftsman's eye and Grace murmuring about where she'd place her rocking chair, Emily felt a flicker of relief. They were perfect, she thought, guardians who'd cherished the place she'd once poured her heart into. Over tea on the terrace, the sale nearly sealed, Emily leaned forward, her voice steady but low. "I have a small favour to ask," she said, setting her cup down. Paul and Grace exchanged a glance, their curiosity piqued. "It's nothing big, but sometime after you settle in, there might be some newcomers showing up. My future ex-husband and his ex-wife, actually." She paused, letting the words hang, watching their expressions shift from surprise to quiet understanding. "They think they're moving in here soon. I haven't told them otherwise yet." Grace's brow furrowed slightly, but a knowing glint sparked in Paul's eyes. "A little surprise for them, then?" he asked, a faint chuckle in his voice. "Something like that," Emily replied, a tight smile tugging at her lips. "I just wanted you to know, so it's not a shock if they turn up. They won't cause trouble, I'll make sure of it." Grace reached over, patting Emily's hand with a warmth that felt like absolution. "Don't you worry, dear. We've handled our share of surprises. This place is ours now, and we'll take good care of it." Emily nodded, gratitude swelling in her chest. The Robinsons weren't just buying a house. They were unwittingly stepping into her plan, the first act of her grand exit. She could already picture James's face when he arrived, bags in hand, only to find strangers in his supposed new nest. It wasn't revenge, not exactly. It was justice, served with a quiet, stylish twist. Emily woke that morning with a fire simmering in her veins, a newfound strength unfurling like a tightly coiled spring, finally released. She was done playing the victim, done letting James's choices dictate her worth. The lake house sale was in motion, the Robinsons poised to take over, and with each step she felt lighter, fiercer, ready to reclaim her happiness and freedom on her terms. She smoothed her hair in the mirror, squared her shoulders and walked into the living room where James sprawled on the couch, the TV blaring some mindless game show. She stood in the doorway for a moment watching him, then cleared her throat. "James, we need to talk." He muted the TV with a flick of the remote and turned to her, one eyebrow lifting. Yeah, I'm listening, he said, his tone casual, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath her calm exterior. Emily crossed her arms, her voice steady as steel despite the pulse hammering in her chest. I think you're right. You should really take care of Sarah and Ethan. James blinked, caught off guard, a slow grin spreading across his face. Really? He chuckled, leaning back against the cushions. You're not upset anymore? I thought we'd be hashing this out for days. No, I'm not upset, she said, locking eyes with him, her gaze unflinching. I get it. You want to help them, and I just want you to be happy. The words tasted like ash, but she delivered them with a cool precision, her face a mask of indifference. His smile widened, relief softening his features. Thank you, Emily. God, you're the best wife in the world, he said, standing to pull her into a hug. His arms wrapped around her, warm and familiar, but her body stayed rigid, her hands limp at her sides. Inside, her heart was a barren field. Not a spark of love remained, only a cold, calculated resolve. She let him hold her, counting the seconds, her mind already leaping ahead to the moment she'd unveil her hand. This wasn't forgiveness. It was a fuse, quietly burning towards the explosion she'd orchestrated. James thought he'd won, but he had no idea the reckoning she'd set in motion. The sale of the lake house had been finalized, sealed in quiet triumph without a whisper reaching James. Emily had kept her cards close, her every move cloaked in a veneer of normalcy. She glided through their routines with practiced ease, stirring pots of chili for his dinners, folding his shirts with crisp precision, smiling faintly when he thanked her. To James, she was the same devoted wife, her warmth a steady hum in the background of his life. But beneath her calm surface, a storm brewed, her plan for revenge sharpening with every passing day. She could already see it, James puffing up with pride when Sarah and Ethan arrived, casting himself as their gallant rescuer, the noble man who'd made it all possible. She relished the thought of that pride curdling, his world crumbling when he realized the home he'd banked on was no longer his to give. When James announced he'd be gone a few days to help Sarah and Ethan pack, Emily nodded, her lips curving into a supportive smile. Take your time, she'd said, handing him a thermos of coffee for the road. Inside, her pulse quickened. Everything was aligning. Paul and Grace Robinson had settled into the lake house, their boxes unpacked, their quiet dreams taking root in the space she'd once called hers. The stage was set, the players in place. All that remained was the final act, the moment she'd deliver her strike. James returned on a crisp morning, his SUV rumbling up the winding road to the lake house, his face alight with anticipation. Sarah sat beside him, radiant, as if the move had shaved a decade off her years, her skin glowing, her eyes dancing with the promise of a fresh start. Ethan slouched in the back seat, earbuds in, his gaze flicking between his phone and the blur of trees outside. The car brimmed with their lives, suitcases wedged against boxes, a soccer ball rolling loose, a duffel stuffed with Ethan's gear. James had planned it all, every detail a testament to the comfort he thought awaited them. He parked with a flourish, turning to Sarah with a grin. Here we are, he said, voice thick with satisfaction, oblivious to the trap Emily had laid, its jaws poised to snap shut. James killed the engine with a twist of the key, and the three of them spilled out of the SUV, the gravel crunching under their feet. He stretched, rolling his shoulders back as he sucked in a lungful of crisp lake air, his chest swelling with pride. The house gleamed in the morning light, sunlight glinting off its weathered walls, casting it in a warm, inviting glow. Well, here we are, he said, turning to Sarah and Ethan with a broad grin. You're gonna love it here. Sarah's lips curved into a smile, though a flicker of something, doubt maybe, shadowed her bright eyes. Ethan barely glanced up from his phone, thumbs tapping away, the world beyond his screen a faint blur of trees and water. James didn't notice, too caught up in his own triumph. Come on, I'll show you inside, he said, striding toward the front door, keys jangling in his hand. He was halfway up the steps when he stopped short, his gaze landing on an elderly couple standing on the porch, peering at them with mild curiosity. "Excuse me," James said, skipping pleasantries, his tone edged with confusion. "What are you doing here?" The man, Paul with his neatly trimmed grey hair and crow's feet framing sharp blue eyes, stepped forward, unruffled. "Well, hello there," he said, his voice steady and warm. "You must be James?" James frowned, unease prickling up his spine. "That's right. And who the heck are you?" Paul cleared his throat, hands clasped casually behind his back. "I'm Paul Robinson. This is my wife, Grace. We bought this house from someone named Emily." The words slammed into James like a thunderclap. He froze, his mouth parting as if to speak, but no sound came. He turned to Grace, her gentle face framed by white curls, her kind eyes meeting his with a quiet nod that confirmed her husband's claim. His legs wobbled beneath him, the keys slipping slightly in his sweaty grip. You bought this house?" he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper, eyes darting between them. That's got to be a prank, right?" "No prank," Paul said, calm as the lake itself. He ducked inside briefly, returning with a folded piece of paper he'd plucked from a shelf. "Here," he said, pressing it into James's trembling hands. James took it mechanically, unfolding the document with numb fingers. His eyes skimmed over it. Stamps, signatures, dates, numbers, but the meaning wouldn't stick. His brain a jumble of static. Sale agreement. Emily's name in bold ink. Finalized. His house. Their house. Gone. Sarah, who'd been hovering silently by the car, finally stepped forward, her brow creased. "What's going on?" she demanded, her voice tight. "Who are these people?" "They say they bought the house," James rasped, panic clawing up his throat. "Bought it from who?" Sarah pressed, her confusion sharpening into irritation. "From Emily," Paul answered, unfazed. "Your wife." James shook his head, desperation creeping in. "No, this is a misunderstanding," he insisted, turning to Paul and Grace. "There's been some mix-up. I'll fix it." He fumbled for his phone, dialing Emily's number with shaking hands. Ring, 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 nothing. He hung up, tried again, the silence on the other end mocking him. "Come on, Em. Pick up," he muttered under his breath, pacing a tight circle on the gravel. Sarah crossed her arms, glancing from James to the house. "I don't understand what's happening," she said, her tone hardening. "Neither do I," James mumbled, staring at the house as if it might explain itself. The cosy walls, the porch he'd pictured them sharing, it all stared back, indifferent, belonging to strangers now. His mind raced, grasping for answers, but one truth was sinking in. Emily had outplayed him, and he hadn't seen it coming. Paul cleared his throat, his gaze settling on James with a mix of pity and quiet reproach. "Listen, young man," he said, his voice steady but kind. "I know this isn't what you expected, but sometimes the answers you're looking for aren't out here. They're in there." He tapped his chest lightly, then stepped back, giving James space to wrestle with the wreckage. Sarah turned to him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Where are we supposed to go now?" she asked, her voice trembling, the hope she'd carried draining away. Ethan finally peeled his eyes from his phone, his brow furrowing as he took in the scene. "Dad, what's going on?" he said, his tone sharp with confusion. "Why can't we go inside?" James opened his mouth, but no words came. He stood there, rooted to the gravel, a fool unmasked, his confidence, his swagger, all of it stripped bare. He'd prided himself on his cleverness, his knack for bending people to his will, only to find himself ensnared in a trap of his own making. I'll figure it out," he muttered, his voice hollow as he pulled out his phone and dialed Emily again. Ring after ring, silence mocked him. He tried once more, desperation tightening his grip, but the line stayed dead. She was gone, vanished like smoke, leaving him stranded with his ex-wife, his son, and a car full of useless dreams. Paul and Grace exchanged a glance, their sympathy tempered by a resolve to let him face his mess. With a quiet nod, they turned and slipped back into the house, the door clicking shut behind them. James stood alone on the porch, the autumn sun casting a cold, unyielding light over him, its glare as merciless as Emily's silence. His legs felt like lead, his mind a tangle of disbelief and dawning horror. He stared at the house, the closed door, the windows reflecting a life that wasn't his anymore, and the truth crashed over him. It was over. His grand plan, his smug certainty, all of it had crumbled. He'd lost the house, his marriage, his dignity, and the only one to blame was the man staring back at him in the glass. Sarah's composure broke, tears spilling down her cheeks as she pressed a hand to her mouth. Ethan, still piecing it together, stepped closer and wrapped an arm around her shoulders, his young face tightening with unease. James watched them, and the weight of his failures pressed harder, betraying Emily, stringing Sarah along, disappointing Ethan. He'd gambled everything and lost, and now the bill was due. He dialed Emily one last time, the rings echoing in his ears like a taunt. Nothing. She'd outmaneuvered him, her revenge a masterpiece, elegant, icy, and devastating. He lowered the phone, defeat settling into his bones, and turned to Sarah and Ethan. "Let's go," he said, his voice barely audible, and started trudging toward the car. Sarah followed, her steps hesitant, her sobs muffled as she trailed behind. Ethan kept pace, glancing back at the house with a mix of confusion and resignation. James slid behind the wheel, started the engine and pulled away, the SUV rolling slowly down the drive. In the rearview mirror, the house shrank, its cozy silhouette fading into the trees. An emptiness yawned inside him, vast and cold, swallowing the last flickers of the man he'd thought he was. James gripped the steering wheel as they drove away, his phone pressed to his ear, redialing Emily with a stubborn desperation. Each unanswered ring gnawed at him, a relentless reminder of his unraveling world. Sarah sat silently beside him, staring out the window, while Ethan slumped in the back, lost in his own thoughts. Finally, as the miles stretched on, a single message buzzed through. "Let's meet tomorrow at the office." No warmth, no hint of reconciliation, just a cold directive. Emily had chosen neutral ground, a sterile conference room over any place that held their shared history. She didn't want to see him, not really, but she needed to face him one last time, to sever the tie with her own hands and watch the light fade from his excuses. The next morning she arrived at the office precisely on time, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she claimed a table by the window. She ordered a black coffee, the steam curling up as she sat, her posture straight, her face a mask of composure. James stumbled in 15 minutes late, his hair disheveled, his breath short as if he'd run the whole way. "Emily, darling, sorry I'm late," he blurted, dropping into the chair across from her, his eyes a frantic mix of despair and flickering hope. She didn't answer, just lifted her cup and took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the silence stretch. He fidgeted, then leaned forward, his voice cracking the tension. "What does all this mean, Em? Do you even understand what you've done?" Emily set her cup down with a soft clink, her gaze locking onto his, steady and unyielding. "I understand everything perfectly," she said, her tone cool and measured. "Better than you ever gave me credit for." James's hands twisted together on the table. "But we dreamed of it together. That house, we dreamed," he said, grasping at the past like a lifeline. "Tough luck," she replied, her voice flat, cutting through his nostalgia like a blade. He shifted tactics, his tone softening into a plea. "What about Ethan? He's just a kid, Em." "And what about me?" she shot back, her calm cracking just enough to let the steel beneath shine through. "Am I just some prop you can shuffle around? A piece of furniture to fit your plans? You thought I'd roll over for anything, let you ride me like some broken horse as long as it suited you. James flinched, his head dipping, his arguments crumbling before they could form. He stared at the table mute, the weight of her words pinning him in place. Every defense he might have mustered sounded feeble, even in his own mind. Emily leaned forward slightly, her voice rising with a quiet, unshakable force. I fooled myself for too long, James. I bought your lies, convinced myself you were honest, that your love was real. But you were just stepping over me, using me to prop up whatever game you were playing with Sarah? Why so cruel? He whispered, his voice barely audible, his eyes darting up to meet hers. Why make a fool of me? Why leave me with nothing? No roof, no home. She didn't blink. What did you expect? A thank you note for betraying me? A round of applause for sneaking your ex-wife into our life so you could both snicker at my expense? Her words were precise, each one a hammer strike, driving the final nails into the wreckage of their marriage. You humiliated me, James. You don't get to play the victim now. He sat there, deflated, the hope draining from his face as the reality of her resolve sank in. Emily took one last sip of her coffee, stood, and walked away, leaving him alone at the table, the echo of her footsteps, the final sound of their story. James reeled, her words hitting him like a slap he hadn't seen coming. What are you talking about, babe? He stammered, his voice faltering as he reached for a lifeline. Emily's eyes glinted, tears brimming but held back by sheer will. I'm disgusting, remember? Fat, snoring like a pig. Her voice trembled, but it carried a razor's edge. Yeah, I read those messages, James. I saw who you really are. He scrambled, panic flashing across his face. Honey, it's not what you think. We were just joking, stupid stuff. Come on, I'm sorry, he said, stepping toward her, arms outstretched for a hug. Don't touch me, she snapped, yanking her hand back as if his touch burned. I loved you, James. I trusted you, ignored your flaws, made excuses for you. But there's a limit to everything, everything. His desperation curdled into irritation, his jaw tightening. So what's going to happen now, he demanded, his tone sharp, as if he could still wrest control. Emily rose from the table, her movements deliberate, her voice steady as stone. Now you'll live with the consequences of what you've done, and I'll start a new life. Without you. She turned on her heel and strode toward the exit, her back straight, her steps resolute. James sat frozen watching her go, the weight of her words pinning him to the chair. The cafe buzzed faintly around him, clinking cups, murmured conversations, but he was a statue, caught in the wreckage of his own making. She didn't look back, and as the door swung shut behind her, he was left alone with the bitter echo of his shattered dreams and the dawning truth of what he'd lost. Time flowed on, and with it, Emily's world began to shift. The fog of her past with James lifted, revealing a stark truth. He'd been coasting on her strength for years, leaning on her while she shouldered the bills, the house, the weight of his choices. She'd let him too, moulding herself to his whims, bending until she nearly broke. But now, unshackled, she stood taller, freer. 6 months after the dust settled, she found herself scrolling through comments on a post she'd shared online, a raw, unfiltered recounting of her marriage's collapse. Most were supportive, some curious, but one stood out. A private message with a link. She clicked it, and there it was. An old post, eerily mirroring her own story, down to the betrayal and the quiet triumph of walking away. She sent back a simple shocked face emoji, half amused, half stunned. The sender replied almost instantly, and soon they were trading messages, tentative at first, then fluid, like a conversation picked up midstream. His name was Kevin, and over the next few months, their chats wove a thread of familiarity that felt like years, not weeks. When she finally suggested meeting, his response came quick, tinged with a shy relief. I was so scared to ask, didn't want to push you after everything you've been through. She smiled at her screen, warmed by his caution, his care. They met at a small cafe, and Kevin was exactly as she'd pictured, unassuming, with a quick laugh and eyes that crinkled when he smiled. They clicked instantly, a spark igniting over shared stories and easy silences. Soon they were spending weekends together, hiking trails, catching local bands, laughing over street food. He wasn't a grand romantic. No flowery words or sweeping gestures. Instead, he'd just look at her, his gaze steady and warm, admiration radiating in the quiet way he held her presence. It stirred something in her, a slow burn that felt truer than any poetry. Still, as weeks turned to months, Emily wondered where it was heading. Kevin never pushed, never rushed, a trait she cherished. But it left her curious. One evening, sprawled on her couch after a movie, she asked, "Do you ever think about where this is going?" He grinned, a glint of mischief in his eyes. "I've got the perfect answer for that." A few days later, he called her up, casual as ever. "Hey, if you're up for it, I'd love for you to meet my parents. No pressure, just thought it'd be nice." She blinked, caught off guard, a flutter of surprise mixing with delight. "Yeah," she said, her smile widening. "I'd like that." It wasn't a grand declaration, but it was Kevin, solid, real, and quietly moving them forward. And for the first time in a long while, Emily felt the ground beneath her steady, promising something good. Emily buzzed with excitement as they drove, the car humming along the winding roads while Kevin's voice filled the space between them. He was answering her earlier question about his parents, his tone warm and easy. "They've been together forever," he said, hands steady on the wheel. "Worked their tails off. Dad in construction, Mom at the hospital, and always stuck by each other, no matter what. Now they're retired, living the dream they saved up for, just enjoying the quiet." Emily hung on his words, picturing two weathered souls who'd built a life brick by brick, their love a quiet constant. She was so swept up in the story that she barely noticed the scenery shifting until they turned onto a street that tugged at her memory. One lone house waiting at its end. Recognition hit her like a jolt, and a grin spread across her face, splitting wide as Kevin rambled on, oblivious. He was mid-sentence. "Dad's obsessed with his garden now, you'll see," when her laughter bubbled up, unstoppable. She clamped a hand over her mouth, but it spilled out anyway, bright and unrestrained. Kevin faltered, glancing over, his own chuckle breaking through as he caught her infectious glee. "What? What's so funny?" he asked, laughing harder even though he was clueless, which only sent her into another peal of giggles. Their shared mirth bounced around the car, a duet of pure, ridiculous joy. Finally, she caught her breath, wiping a tear from her eye. Okay, she said, still grinning, and nodded toward the house ahead. "Keep going. What kind of future do you see for us?" Kevin slowed the car, his laughter fading into a soft smile as he pointed out the windshield. "Something like that," he said simply. There on the porch of the lake house, her lake house, stood Paul and Grace waving cheerfully, their figures framed against the familiar wood and stone. Emily's heart skipped, a rush of warmth flooding her chest. Kevin didn't know the half of it, didn't know she'd sold this place, that it had once been her dream turned to ash. But here it was, full circle glowing with new life. She looked at him, his steady gaze fixed on the house, and saw what he meant. A future grounded in quiet strength, in partnership, in something real. And for the first time, she believed she could have it too. As Kevin pulled the car to a stop in front of the lake house, Paul and Grace stepped off the porch, their waves turning to wide-eyed stares as Emily climbed out, her grin still lingering. Paul's mouth dropped open, his grey brows shooting up. "Well, I'll be... Emily," he said, his voice a mix of disbelief and delight. Grace clutched her husband's arm, her kind eyes darting between Emily and Kevin. "You're... her... Emily? The one who sold us this place?" she gasped, a laugh tumbling out as she pressed a hand to her chest. "What are the odds?" Kevin blinked, turning to Emily, his own surprise catching up. Wait, this is your lake house? He asked, piecing it together mid-chuckle. You didn't say a word. I didn't know how to, Emily replied, her laughter bubbling up again. I was too busy losing it when I realized where we were going. The four of them stood there, caught in a whirlwind of astonishment and amusement, the coincidence too perfect to fathom. Come in, Grace insisted, ushering them inside with a flustered wave. We've got to sit down and sort this out over dinner. The house smelled of roasted chicken and fresh herbs, the table already set with mismatched plates and a vase of wildflowers Paul had picked that morning. They settled in, passing dishes of mashed potatoes and green beans, the conversation flowing as easily as the wine Grace poured. Paul shook his head repeatedly, still marvelling. Of all the people Kevin could have brought home, it's the girl who handed us our dream, he said, raising his glass. Fate's got a funny way of tying knots. At one point, as the plates emptied and the candles flickered low, Paul leaned back in his chair, a twinkle in his eye. You know, he said, glancing at Grace, I told her after we met you, Emily. Your story reminded me of our Kevin. Grace nodded, her smile soft. It's true. We said it that very night. The table erupted in laughter, Kevin nudging Emily with a grin. Months later, under a sky streaked with summer gold, Emily and Kevin stood hand in hand, exchanging vows on a grassy bluff overlooking a different lake, one untainted by old ghosts. The ceremony was small, intimate, with Paul and Grace beaming from the front row like proud parents. Emily wore a simple dress that hugged her in all the right places, and Kevin, true to form, skipped the mushy poetry but held her gaze with a quiet intensity that said everything. When they kissed, the handful of guests cheered, and Paul let out a whistle that made Grace elbow him with a laugh. They settled into a life that felt like a steady exhale, unhurried, real, and theirs. Emily found her stride again, running trails with Kevin at dawn, her body strong and hers once more. He built her a bookshelf for the little house they bought together, a cozy fixer-upper miles from the past. Nights were spent with mugs of tea and shared silences, his presence a comfort she'd never tire of. Paul and Grace visited often, bringing jars of homemade jam and stories that wove them tighter into the fold. And as the years unfolded, Emily knew she'd found her place, not in a house, but in a life built on trust, laughter, and a love that didn't need words to prove itself. She was at last truly happy. Truly.